For some people, this is a real surprise that the School of Education would have a neuroscientist, but here at UW-Madison there are lots of surprises, and Ed is one of the most positive surprises. So Ed got almost all of his education, at least beginning with a college degree, in California. He got his bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley. He got his master's degree in experimental psychology from UC San Diego, and he stayed there for a PhD in 2004 in psychology and cognitive science. Then he did a series of postdoctoral stints, one of them in France, in what he says was the French equivalent of the NIH, INSERM. And then he did a postdoctoral stint at Vanderbilt. And in the last year of that, which took him right up to 2012, he was a postdoctoral fellow in one of the departments at Vanderbilt, and he was a postdoctoral affiliate in the Kennedy Center for Human Development at Vanderbilt. In 2012, he came to UW-Madison and began his trek as a faculty member. So he's an assistant professor now. His publication record is almost unbelievable for an assistant professor. He has 31 peer-reviewed papers, 8 of which were published when he was a student. He has 10 book chapters, and he's the co-author of a book on synesthesia. I guess if you can pronounce it, you should know what it means. That's a real mouthful, synesthesia. It requires a lot of tongue work. And he's been invited 42 times to give lectures, so this is number 43, I think, unless he snuck one in. And he is an ad hoc reviewer on for more journals than I was able to count from his CV. If there's one measure about whether you're popular, it's that you get tagged to do work for journals. And Ed must be one of the most popular people in neuroscience, because he's ad hoc for neuroscience and for vision and all this stuff, all over the place. So Ed is extremely well regarded and very popular. Today he's going to talk about something which is really close to my heart and the program's heart. Because the program now has 3 integrated degree tracks, and I am determined, before I hang up my hat, that we're going to have a 4th one. And that one is going to be in neuroscience and education. And I hope that Ed will lay the groundwork for making that go smoothly. And so I proudly present you with Ed Hubbard.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Ron. So, as Ron says, I have been an ad hoc reviewer for quite a lot of journals, but it may not be a mark of popularity. It may just be a mark of the fact that I don't know how to say no. So there may be another component to it there. So I'd like to tell you guys today about work that we're doing in my lab, the Educational Neuroscience Lab, that we really see as building the foundations for a new field, bridging between education and neuroscience. And if you look out in the media, it seems like brain training is everywhere. There are all these various different games, Nintendo DS, there's curricula, even for elementary schools, called Brain Gym. You can see this poor brain just working away there, trying to get stronger and bigger and faster. There's Lumosity, which you pretty much see everywhere on the web, TV ads, these sorts of things. There's even a commercial for Virgin Mobile with a guy sitting in a brain-shaped chair who looks suspiciously like MIT's Steve Pinker. And he wheels around and he tells you to retrain your brain. Now the goal is actually to get you to buy Virgin Mobile cell phone contracts. So I'm not sure how retrained your brain would be, but the idea that what we are doing is training our brain in various different ways seems to be out there everywhere. And it's not only captured the popular imagination, it also has captured the imagination of serious scientists and educators. So These are a number of the books that have come out within the past few years. Some of these, for example, are written by former educators. John Geek is an educator in Australia who actually was one of the founders of the British annual series dedicated to looking at links between education and neuroscience. Paul Howard-Jones, this is very clearly introducing neuroeducational research, clearly a book targeted at his academic colleagues. And then there are other people like Eric Jensen, who is writing really for teachers. If I'm really honest about it, Eric Jensen's book is a little muddled. I would not recommend it, but he's at least trying to get the word out there. And then there are various different, for example, edited volumes. So the Pope, not the current Pope, but back in 2002, the Pope had the Pontifical Academy of Sciences come and speak to him about what we know about education and brains. And so people from all over the planet that have been interested in education and brains came and talked with the Pope, and that then turned into this edited volume. So we can see not only this sort of popular interest, but also this serious academic interest growing in trying to bridge between education and neuroscience. And so you might ask, well, why is that? What is the common ground that people are starting to see? And the way I see it is that all three of these fields have started to recognize that they share an interest in learning and cognition at various different levels. So you think about teachers, primarily what they're doing through teaching, through pedagogy, is thinking about student learning and thinking about how do I change this child's understanding of a particular topic? How do I change their cognition? Experimental psychology similarly has been focusing on how learning and cognition take place in laboratory settings for well over 100 years. And then when we think about neuroscience that's focused on brain structures, brain processes that are involved in learning and cognition, broadly plasticity. So how is it that the brain changes as you go through these different learning events? And so these different fields then have come together to create this sort of union of mind, brain, and education, or what I really think of as sort of educational neuroscience. So we talk a lot in this field about building bridges, but in many cases the feeling is also that these bridges are incomplete. So for those of you that know, this is the San Francisco bridge that is replacing the old span that collapsed partially in the 1989 earthquake. So here's this beautiful new bridge, but as you can see, that new bridge is not complete yet. And the suggestion is that we can't actually build a single bridge directly from neuroscience, especially from cellular and molecular levels of neuroscience, but rather that we're going to need to build multiple bridges. So if we think about, again, this sort of San Francisco-Oakland bridge, there are really two separate bridges, one from Oakland to Yerba Buena Island, and one from Yerba Buena Island to San Francisco. And you might liken that to bridges from instruction to cognition, from cognition to neuroscience, and then perhaps cognitive psychology being that island in the middle that bridges between these two different spans. And so what we really need is this multi-level approach where we bring together people who are doing serious, rigorous neuroscience work, who are doing the cognitive psychology, and then who are also thinking about the instructional and pedagogical implications of this. And so this is not a job that we can do with just one person. Instead, we need to have multiple different people approaching this from multiple different directions so that we get this bidirectional flow of information across these multiple bridges. And one analogy that I particularly like is this analogy with the early days of medical science. So if we think about what was happening in the late 1800s, doctors had all sorts of different methods that they could use to cure people who were sick, who were injured. And some of those methods really seemed to work, but maybe they still didn't even know why, especially down at this fundamental cellular and molecular type of level. Other methods didn't really work. Sometimes the theory was sound, but the method didn't turn out the way that people expected it to. Sometimes the theory was just wrong. And if we look at what happened starting then in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, the early 20th century, we started to see the advent of evidence-based medicine. And along with that, we think about how biology, physiology, chemistry, physics, all of these are now an essential part of medical training. And as a consequence of that, we can see this dramatic rise in life expectancy. So if you were born, for example, in 1897, you could have an average life expectancy of about 47. If you look now, the average life expectancy is nearly 80. So people who are born now have a life expectancy of nearly 80 years. And you can see that this rise is almost continuous, except for in 1918. So you know the flu that swept the entire world, the influenza pandemic of 1918, you can see what a huge impact that had on average life expectancy. And a lot of that was because young children and infants would die very young. And so the average life expectancy dropped dramatically in 1918. But other than that, you can see this huge improvement. And the suggestion is that now we have educators who, through trial and error, through being in the classroom, especially within the past 150 years or so that we've had universal education, educators have started to develop a number of different methods. And in the same way that medicine didn't really know why some of their methods worked, didn't really know why some of their methods didn't work, teachers are in a similar sort of state now. But just like medicine was becoming an evidence-based field 100 years ago, education is now moving in that same direction of starting to have much more evidence taken into the decisions. So if we think about, for example, the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the funding arm of the Department of Education, they're driving towards a lot more randomized control trials of the same sort that we would typically think of as being the gold standard in medicine. So you see these types of changes. And in the same way that we might think of biology as the foundation for what's happening in medicine, neuroscience and psychology can provide the basic science that supports education. And that means that neuroscientists and educators will be required to start to learn to translate between their different fields. And one thing that really sort of highlights how far we've come in terms of medical education and what we might think about as a model for what we want to do in terms of thinking about changing teacher education is to look at this Flexner Report. So the Carnegie Foundation funded this guy, Flexner, to basically go around the United States and look at medical schools all throughout the United States. And in 1910, he visited Wisconsin, and he looked at the medical schools in the state of Wisconsin. If we look in Madison, you see that you have the University of Wisconsin College of Medicine, organized in 1907. The entrance requirement to get into medical school at the University of Wisconsin in 1910 was 2 years of college work, including sciences. And that was rigidly enforced. There were 49 medical students here at the University of Wisconsin. The laboratory facilities, complete in number, were admirably equipped with respect to both teaching and research. A successful effort has been made to provide facilities worthy of students on a 2-year college basis and of teachers deserving opportunities for progressive work. The department lacks only a building which shall bring its parts together. So that was in 1910 where we were at. You compare that with Milwaukee. Milwaukee was a stock company. It was organized, now nominally the medical department of Marquette. To get into medical school in 1910, the entrance requirement was a 4-year high school education, or its equivalent. That's all it took to get into medical school in 1910. And the summary for the state of Wisconsin, I think, is quite telling. So Flexner says, Wisconsin presents a simple problem. The 2 Milwaukee schools are without a redeeming feature. It is claimed that the examiner representing the state board enforces a 4-year high school standard, but it has been impossible to procure any information at all from this official, though repeated efforts have been made to do so. Neither of the schools meets the most lenient standards in respect to laboratory outfit or teaching, and as for clinical facilities, they are hardly more than nominal. A Western state so admirably organized on the educational side, furnishing excellent college opportunities without cost to the student, is surely in position to meet Minnesota and Indiana in the matter of practice standards. The requirement of a year or 2 of college work as preliminary to practice would quickly leave the medical department at the state university in sole control. So here, just 100 years ago, you ask anybody who's a pre-med undergraduate here about their experience, and it's radically different from this. It is not 4 years of high school to go to med school. It is 4 years of extremely rigorous college coursework in a very competitive sort of environment, especially to go to the top med schools. And so Flexner issued these sorts of recommendations. He said that we should actually reduce the number of medical schools. He recommended which ones be closed. That would then in turn reduce the number of poorly trained physicians, increase the prerequisites, train physicians to practice in a scientific manner, engage all medical faculty in research, give the medical schools control of clinical instruction in the hospitals, strengthen state regulation of medical licensure. And if you look before this report, 16 out of 155 medical schools across the entire United States required 2 or more years. Only 16 out of 155, so just over 10%. By 1920, this number had risen to 92%. One thing that it's unclear about is how much the Flexner Report caused these changes rather than reflected changes that were already happening in society and sort of captured the zeitgeist of the moment. What were people already thinking? Where was the direction of things at that moment? And as a consequence, there were a number of positive things. So we think about now the 6+ years of formal instruction that physicians receive, that medical research adheres to these scientific protocols, that average physician quality increases, and medicine has become this highly paid and well-respected field. On the other hand, and especially if we were to think about this as a potential policy implication, that we might change education training, so teacher training in the United States, more than half of all the medical schools merged or closed, and the cost of medical school increased. Many fewer women and minorities were able to attend medical school because of these changes. And then there were fewer MDs, which differentially impacted the underserved communities. So communities that already had too few doctors had even fewer. So if we were to think about the changes that education and neuroscience coming together might have in terms of teacher training, we have to think both about the positives and also about the potential negatives and how we might try and manage this sort of transition to raise the standard for teacher education on the medical side, and then also raise the standard for what we're doing on the neuroscience side for trying to bring in the insights from teachers, from school districts, and really think about the experiences that are driving children's brains in various different ways. And eventually, we might sort of see this in the same way that we think about medicine, that there are these many layers of experts. So you have, for example, people who are basic researchers in genetics, chemistry, physics, basic biological processes. Some of these people may also then engage in translational research. Some of them may, for example, be dual MD PhDs who engage in some basic and translational research that's inspired by their practice, and then also think about various different applications of the things that they're doing in the research. But if we think about the majority of people, they typically end up in just one of these boxes. And then interposed between this basic research are all of these different things, making sure that what the basic research is suggesting actually scales up. So if we look at, for example, phase 3 trials, someplace between 50 and 80% of ideas that look like they're possibly good ideas, potentially useful ideas, in the early development phases don't actually succeed when we get to phase 3 trials. So there's a huge disconnect between, for example, biological research and what eventually ends up being evidence-based when we think about going out and helping lots of patients. And then eventually, we have the individual people who are working directly with the patients. So they're family members, doctors, nurses, all of these sorts of people. In the same way, we might think about education as having many layers of experts, including people who are doing basic research in chemistry and biology, neuroscience, psychology, educational psychology, thinking about perhaps the educational materials industry as equivalent to the pharmaceutical industry, with some of the same concerns about conflict of interest that you see in pharmaceuticals. You might also be concerned about some of those in education. And then the Institute of Education Sciences, IES, playing some of the same role as the FDA in starting to think about regulation of these things, but also, for example, school boards, and then eventually teachers, parents, and TAs influencing the experience of an individual student. So, as you can see here, it's very unlikely that any one person ever would fill all of these roles, either in the medical side or in the education side. And we expect this on the medical side, that we're going to see people who are doing more of the basic research, more of the applied or translational research, and then people whose primary role is really in interacting with patients. But we don't think about it the same way on the education side, that there are people doing the research, that there are teachers, that some people might bridge multiple different levels. And so I think that this is one of the things that as we start to grow this field, we need to think more and more about is how do we train people to be able to be effective at multiple different levels. And so for me, this is the big point. Education builds brains. Every time we're learning something, we're changing the brain. And In my lab, we're interested in three main areas. So primarily thinking about math and number, but also thinking about the impact of things like executive function, attention, visual spatial processes. Thinking about math and number also as something that links up with reading processes. So you have to recognize those numbers on the page. And so we think about executive function as this sort of domain general ability. Being able to focus and pay attention helps you to learn to read, helps a child to learn math, helps them to learn to ski, or anything else that they might want to do. So being able to focus these executive functions is not specific to a specific domain of learning. On the other hand, when we think about math and reading, those are those sort of domain-specific abilities. And so we can examine all three of these to contrast the general principles of learning, to start to identify what's going on for math in particular, what's going on for reading in particular, and then what's going on more broadly. And if we look at a lesson from lots of neuroscience studies, it suggests that frontal brain regions are driving the specialization of these posterior circuits that are involved in math, number, and also in reading. But those circuits aren't coming from nothing. I want to talk just a bit about the importance of math more broadly. So if we think about math at a sort of national level, we can see that the United States, for example, is ranked number 25 on this PISA competition, so this international ranking. You can see Finland and Korea are performing extremely well compared to the United States. So this is something that we see often in the media, is that this is a threat to American dominance in science, technology, engineering, math fields, these STEM fields broadly. But it's deeper than that. So if we think about not only math skills at this level, and think about individual people's lives, what we can see is that people's math and number skills, numeracy broadly, explains differences in HIV patients and their ability to actually comply with the medication instructions that they receive. And sometimes these medications require that you take half a dose at one time, half a dose at another time, 2 hours before a meal, but 3 hours after some other pill that requires food to be taken with it. So HIV medication can be extremely complicated, and actually following that, it turns out that it depends on math and number skills in a variety of different ways. Similarly, it can be shown that number skills contributed to the subprime mortgage crisis. People with poor math skills were more likely to actually enter into a predatory mortgage and were therefore more likely to be in a bad financial situation. And then finally, in the UK, they followed a group of people who were born in 1960 and then looked at their basically high school exit exams, their A-levels. Looked at their math and their literacy skill, and then looked at, for example, how often had they been in trouble with the police. And so the blue bars are people who struggle both with math and with literacy. The red bars are people who had good literacy skills but struggled with math. And then the two brown bars are people who had struggles with literacy but not with math, or struggles with neither. And so what you can see here is that people who had struggles with math independent of their literacy skills were more likely to end up having been cautioned by the police, having been arrested, having been suspended from school. And these same people are more likely at age 30 to report that they're depressed. They're more likely to have actually seen a clinician for symptoms of depression at age 30. So their A-level scores at age 16 in math are predicting these sorts of things. So we typically here in the United States think of literacy as king. Children go from learning to read to reading to learn. And so part of what I'm suggesting is that we've been ignoring another very important component, which is how much math is contributing not just to STEM fields, but also contributing to all of these aspects of day-to-day living. And what we can see is that there are these stable individual differences. So this is a meta-analysis of 8 studies. So 8 studies. There were 6 in the United States, 1 in Canada, 1 in the UK. And they looked at school entry math skills in kindergarten or first grade, and then looked at math skills in later years. They looked at reading skills at school entry and later years. Those later years varied between about 6th grade and high school entrance. They looked at attention skills, internalizing and externalizing, so social behaviors, and then also social skills. And what you can see here is that math skills at school entry predict math skills years and years and years later. And at one level, this sounds fairly intuitive. Math predicts math. But at another level, this is really a striking finding that children are changing what they're being asked to do in math. They're being asked initially to do basic arithmetic, to just deal with number symbols and think about the quantities that they stand for. Then they're being asked to enter into symbolic relations where X stands for some unknown. They're then being asked to use various different visual spatial manipulations to think about trigonometry. And then finally on up to, for most high school students who are college bound, on up to calculus. So we're asking children to do lots and lots of different things throughout their educational experience. So the fact that math predicts math is a really striking finding that suggests that there might be some sort of stable individual difference. And importantly, this study then also controlled for some of the other big factors that we know about. For example, family education background, family income. These studies controlled for that, and when you enter into this meta-analysis, those have already been factored out. We still see this individual difference. And so the question that we've been asking is, well, what is that stable difference? And a number of different studies have started to suggest that number sense, or the ability to sort of understand quantities, might be the key for making this stable individual difference in math abilities. So if you look at people in cognitive neuroscience, in education, and even in special education, a number of different people have started to converge on this idea of number sense. And we can see, for example, that children with math difficulties have deficits in basic aspects of number sense, including things like magnitude comparison, just saying which of two sets of dots is more, which of two Arabic numerals is more, in counting, even in identifying those symbolic Arabic numerals. And we can be more precise about what this number sense is by thinking about what we call the approximate number system. And it's this basic system for understanding quantities. It works like other perceptual systems. So in the same way that you can see that something is redder or bluer, you can see that things are more or less numerous. But it only gives us a rough estimate of number. It's not an exact symbolic system. And it's present even without education. So we can see it in infants, we can see it in non-human animals, we can see it in people, for example, tribes in the Amazon that have a limited number vocabulary. So it suggests that this is a sort of shared foundation. I'll show you guys two fairly quick videos. In the first, this is from Liz Brannon and her group down at Duke University. And what you're seeing here is a 6-month-old infant. And you're mostly watching his eyes. So the pinwheel will draw his eyes to the center. And then here on the left, you can see that there are dots that are alternating in number. Whereas here, it's the same number of dots repeating over and over again. And as you can see, he's already picked up on the fact that the number of dots is changing on this side. And change is more interesting than things that stay the same. Now notice that the displays here are changing position, they're changing size. This is also changing position and size. So it's not just any sort of change. It really seems to be that changing number is attracting his attention over here. And the fact that he can pick up on that change tells us that he is sensitive to the difference between those two quantities. Now, interestingly, he can do this when it's a 2-to-1 ratio, so 10 versus 20, for example. But he can't do this at 6 months if it were 10 versus 15, so a 3-to-2 ratio. By the time he's 9 months old, he'll be able to reliably do 3-to-2, and you and I as adults can reliably do about 10 versus 9. So this system becomes, much like our other perceptual systems, becomes more precise with age. And then we can show that even monkeys can perform basic non-symbolic operations over these quantities. And so this is Liz Brandon and one of her students, Jessica Cantlin. They presented these monkeys with videos of, for example, 6 dots and then 4 dots are taken away. And the monkey has to choose how many dots are left behind the screen. 1 dot, 1 dot, 2. And you can see on some trials, the number of dots that is correct is very different from the number of dots that's the incorrect trial. So the ratio between the correct and the distractor is very large. And so that makes it pretty easy for the monkey. On other trials, you can see that the two are pretty similar, and so that makes it very hard for the monkey. And monkeys, when it's hard, will be less accurate, not surprisingly, and will also take more time to make their decision. But then the kicker is that Jessica and Liz had undergraduate students at Duke do exactly the same thing. And when they made sure that the Duke undergraduates weren't able to count, Duke undergrads and these monkeys performed essentially the same. As it got harder, Duke undergrads did worse. They also took longer in the same way that the monkeys do. So this suggests that there's a shared system that's not just doing quantities, but really doing mental operations on those quantities that we inherit as big primates. And then we can even start to drill into what is the neural system that supports this. So Andreas Nieder, when he was a postdoc at MIT with Earl Miller, did a very simple study. He just presented monkeys with a set of dots, say for example 4 dots, and asked them to remember how many dots they had been presented with over a delay of 1 second. And then they were presented with either a non-matched stimulus, so 3 dots after seeing 4, or a stimulus that matched in number. And here you can see, again, the position of the dots varies, the size of the dots varies, so it's not just a simple perceptual matching. It really is, in some sense, recognizing the sameness of the number. And then, if the number matched, the monkey released a lever and got a juice reward. If the number did not match, the monkey would hold that lever for the entire duration. Then the match stimulus appears, and they then release the lever to get the juice reward. And then they recorded from individual neurons in parietal cortex, in particular in the fundus of the intraparietal sulcus, and also in prefrontal cortex. And what you can see is that there are individual neurons that have become either were there already or through the training paradigm we weren't really clear on in these early studies. More recent studies have suggested that they were there, but they become perhaps more precise with tuning, with that in their tuning with practice. But they respond to number. So you can see, for example, here's your standard firing rate histogram for the shaded period where the number was actually presented. This neuron fires some for 1, fires more for 2, more for 3, 4, and then back down for 5. So you start to see this really nice tuning curve where this neuron is tuned for 4 items. And then he introduced various different controls, for example, controlling for the area of the number. Here's a neuron where you can see that, in fact, it fires less than its baseline firing rate for all of the numerosities. And what you can see is that that decrease occurs for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you see this decrease in firing rate. You again see this tuning function. This neuron would seem to be tuned for 1. If you look across lots and lots of neurons and you start to average across those populations, what you can see is that there's a bank of these neurons in the intraparietal sulcus that show these tuning functions. And critically, if you plot this on a log scale, you can see that these tuning functions are actually symmetrical, which is just what we see when we think about that ratio behavior that the infant was showing us. That it's not the absolute number, it really is a ratio, and again, the same ways that we think about for other perceptual systems. And then if we start to look at what we see not only in monkeys, these parietal frontal systems, but in 3-month-old infants, in a study that I'll tell you more about where we looked at translating between quantities and symbols in children, even doing approximate subtraction in adults, and integral calculus in adults, these same parietal networks are recruited over and over and over again. So this suggests that when we think about math and number, we're really thinking about this approximate number system as a foundation. And this foundation down here is what we share with animals, what's present already in infants, and then we start to build on that. We link that up with various different other cognitive and neural systems, so spatial systems, language systems, body representations, for example, finger counting, Arabic numeral symbols, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, some of these types of things fit well in the constraints of an fMRI environment. But for example, if we wanted to do an fMRI study of Andrew Weil solving Fermat's theorem, that might be something that wouldn't fit into the constraints of the MRI environment. So we have more information about some of these basic processes and much less about, for example, the understanding of the complex plane or people doing various different topological proofs. These would be interesting to start to explore, but they don't lend themselves well to the neuroimaging environment. So I'll tell you more about some of these basic sorts of things. And the fundamental idea is that we take that approximate number system that we have and we start to link that with other systems. And primarily today, I'm going to focus on these two, thinking about linking quantities with number symbols, and then thinking about linking quantities with the spatial system, the sort of mental number line. And so the big goal is to understand how do we go from this to this. And to break this down into a more manageable chunk, we might look at the acquisition of number symbols in young children. So there's a computational model that suggests that exactly the same neurons, or the same artificial neurons in this model, that respond most to, for example, 3 items in the world, also through training come to respond to 3 as a number symbol. And so if we see this prediction, we can actually start to design a test for this. I can't record from individual neurons in parietal cortex in kindergarten through 3rd grade children. But what I can do is indirectly measure the average of their population response. So let's say that I've got a neuron. In this case, this is from a study that Manuela Piazza did in 2004, 16. So this neuron responds really strongly to 16. You show it 16 dots. Because it responds strongly, it also adapts a lot. So if adaptation is proportional to firing rate, a neuron that fires strongly to 16 will adapt a lot. A neuron that responds most strongly to 20 also fires a little bit to 16 and therefore will adapt a little bit. And a neuron that responds most strongly to 24 won't respond at all to 16, so it doesn't adapt. So you present 16 over and over and over again, and the responses to neurons that are tuned for 16 will decrease, and the fMRI signal will then correspondingly decrease. And then you can present, for example, 16 dots again, which would give you a small response. You could present 12 dots, which should give you an intermediate response, 8 dots, which would give you a large response, and then vice versa for 20 and 24. And then you can search the whole brain for regions that show stronger responses to far deviance than to same or close deviance. And when Manuela did this, she found that these parietal regions bilaterally were exactly those regions that were responding more to the far deviance than the close deviance. And then in other runs, instead of adapting to 16, you can adapt to 8 or 32 so that you can show that it's nothing specific about 8 or 32 or 16. It really is something about the history of adaptation. And that type of method now has been applied to show that 4-year-old children also show this, and they respond more strongly to number changes than to shape changes in parietal cortex, more strongly to shape changes than number changes, so change from, for example, from circles to triangles, down in ventral visual areas that are involved in shape and object recognition. Similar sorts of patterns even in 3-month-old infants. And then you can look to see whether or not you can test the links between quantities and symbols by, for example, showing adults, in this case 17, 18, 19, and then you show them 20. 20 is close, so you'd expect a small brain response. 50 is far, so you'd expect a large brain response. But the key trick here is that sometimes 17, 18, and 19 are presented as Arabic numerals. And then you're presented either with Arabic numerals or dots, so digits or Arabic. Sometimes you're presented with the dots and then the Arabic. And what you can see is that in all 4 cases, these same parietal regions show this rebound effect where they respond more strongly to the far deviance than to the close deviance. So independent of notation, we see this link between quantities and symbols. And we use this in kindergarten through 3rd grade children to start to explore this. So we showed them something that was slightly more child-friendly, 6 dots or 8 dots. We told them that they were helping Sally the scientist and her team to get back to Earth. And so all they had to do was press the button when they saw the planet. These were our kids. I won't go into all of the details here, but suffice to say they were fairly typically developing. They were private school kids, and actually, if anything, they're slightly doing better than the standardized test would predict for their grades. And the key thing is that we found exactly what we predicted. So we found this crossover interaction where after seeing, say, for example, 8 a bunch of times, the response to 9 was small. The response to 5 was large, and vice versa. After seeing 6 a lot of times, the response to 5 was small, and the response to 9 was large. And that was in this intraparietal sulcus region, especially in the left hemisphere here, so just where we'd expect it to be. There's some additional complications that I think are really interesting. I won't have time to get into those because I want to make sure that I talk a little bit about some of the math, the mental number line stuff. But if we look at this, we can show that there's a nice relationship between the response to the close deviance, so the precision of their quantity system, and years of schooling. But that's then mediated by a behavioral test of how they do just on comparing non-symbolic quantities. And that's true for the digits and for the dots. So it suggests that these links between schooling experience and how the brain responds are then mediated by another individual difference measure that we can start to link. So this tells us how the brain is starting to build these links between that quantity system and that Arabic numeral system. It's mediated then by the precision of the system. I'm going to skip these two questions because I want to make sure that I get also into this number line stuff. So at a higher level, we might start to think about making links not just between quantities and symbols, but also between quantities and space. So we typically think of numbers along a sort of mental number line. Small numbers are on the left in our culture where we read from left to right, large numbers on the right. You can actually show that that direction shifts in different cultures. But the idea that there's this link seems to be fairly universal. And if we start to compare brain regions that are involved in calculation with brain regions that are involved in eye movements, we see this strong overlap between those systems. We also see a system that's perhaps involved in grasping. So this might be part of the finger counting link, although I won't talk about that today. On the education side, there's really nice work that's been done, for example, by Bob Sigler and one of his students, Geeta Ramani, where they looked at taking children from low SES backgrounds. So these were Head Start children who hadn't had a lot of experience playing board games. And they looked at their number abilities, and they did really poorly. One task that they asked the children to do was simply to place numbers at their appropriate position along a line. So if you asked them where 5 went, they said 5 went in the middle. But if you asked them where 1 went, they also said that 1 went in the middle and that 9 went in the middle. So they basically had no idea about organizing numbers spatially. And then they played one of 2 games, and this was a fairly brief period. I think it was 20 minutes a day for 1 week. And they played this game in the schools, and children who played this linear game showed a marked improvement. Children who played this circular game did not show this improvement. They also did it in a version of the game where they had numbers and the child had to move a certain number of spaces based on a spinner, or a game more like Candyland where they just had the colors and they had to move, for example, from the blue square to the next green square, and they didn't think about numbers. So they had exactly the same experiences, except for they were focusing either more on numbers or more on colors. And in both of those cases, they were able to show that this little bit of board game experience changed how they did on this behavioral task, and that then generalized to a number of other math abilities. And so we sort of think about this mental number line where numbers are represented with more similar numbers close together, smaller numbers on the left, larger numbers on the right. And what I think is happening here is that there's actually this sort of evolutionary precursor. So in monkeys, we already see these networks for number and for space intermingled in the intraparietal sulcus, and then education is basically taking those, retraining it, and building on it. So Bob Sigler talks about what he calls the wisdom of culture. Educators, through lots and lots of experiences, have found things that work, and they pass those along. Those things that work are the things that are easiest for our brain to acquire because of the way that our brains are set up. And so educators have done it on one side, we're coming at it on the other side, but these two ideas then mean that we see this convergence across neuroscience and education to think about spatial representations of numbers. And we can even start to then do various different behavioral tasks that show that there's this spatial link between numbers. So one simple version is that we ask people simply to indicate whether a number is odd or even. In one block, they indicate that the number is odd with their left hand. In the other block, they indicate that it's odd with their right hand. And then, unbeknownst to the subjects, what we're really interested in is how big is the number. So 1 is a small number, 9 is a large number. And then we just take the amount of time that it takes them and subtract the right hand from the left hand. So if you're faster with your left hand, then right minus left is going to be positive. If you're faster with your right hand, then right minus left is going to be negative. And so you can see this very clear relationship where people are faster with their right hand for big numbers, faster with their left hand for small numbers. It turns out it's not just hands. So if I have you cross your hands, you're now faster with your left hand on the right side of space for big numbers. If I ask you to move your eyes to the left or to the right, you're faster to move your eyes to the left for small numbers. If I ask you to do it with foot pedal responses, you're faster with your left foot for small numbers. So it seems to be independent of what effector you're actually using. So it's not just, for example, typing experience. It's something much deeper than that. And so we started to look at exactly this. I'm going to skip a couple of these sort of setup slides. We started to look at exactly this by having people in the scanner do exactly that SNARC task, and also had them make eye movements in the scanner. So they either move their eyes to the left or to the right. In some blocks, we had them respond with their right hand on the right side of space. Some blocks, they responded with their left hand on the right side of space. So in this way, we could actually disentangle the hand that they were using to press the button and the side of space that they were responding on. And we could then define 3 different spatially selective regions along the intraparietal sulcus. So we can define a region that is selective to the hand, and that's in the more anterior portion of the IPS. And so, for example, here you're seeing in the left hemisphere, right greater than left, left greater than right in the right hemisphere. This is not a surprise. Here we can see that the side of space matters, so left versus right and right versus left. It's hard to see, but there is a little blob right there. And then finally, we can see this for eye movements, leftward versus rightward eye movements. So once we define those regions, we can then ask, well, how does, for example, left hand versus right hand responses impact brain activity? And so we do the same thing that we've done before with that subtraction, right minus left. And so in the left hemisphere, not surprisingly, we expect right hand activity, right hand movements to elicit greater activity. That's just what we see, vice versa. In fact, that should not be a surprise because that's also how we define that region. Same thing here with space, same thing here with eye movements. The real kicker, though, is that when we looked at number magnitude, and what we can see here is that there's a small but significant effect, a small but significant interaction between magnitude and hemisphere in the same direction as these eye movements. And so this tells us that the same brain systems that are involved in moving your eyes around in space are also involved when you're dealing with numerical magnitudes. Now this effect was, as you can see, in terms of the effect size, in terms of the actual signals, about the same as what we saw for actually moving your eyes, but the variability here was much less. The variability here was much larger. And so we looked at this. We only had 12 participants in this study, but we did look to see if there was a correlation between their behavioral measure and their fMRI measure, and we did see that those two went in the same direction, but it was not significant, probably just the 12 subjects. So then we wanted to dig into this further. I won't tell you about the ERP study because I really want to talk about this one. So what we did here is we had people in the scanner and they had a little rest period, and then they were warned, you're going to do an addition task. You're going to see this set of dots, for example, for 300 milliseconds. Then there's a delay. They're reminded that they're doing addition. Another set of dots, 300 milliseconds. And then they're asked to mentally add these two. And then once this delay period is done, we ask them to indicate which of these is the correct one. And we did that for small and large quantities with arrays of dots, also for small and large quantities with symbolic numerals, and then we also had some color trials where they just saw blue, blue, and picked blue. So the stimuli were identical. And then critically, what we did is we trained up a classifier on leftward versus rightward eye movement. So this was a support vector machine. And we just trained this classifier to discriminate leftward eye movements versus rightward eye movements. And what you can see here is that, not surprisingly, the classifier could do this. This is a fairly trivial task. And so for all of the participants, the classifier could do it. But then we took that same classifier and we fed it the data from when people were doing the addition and subtraction task. And what we were able to show is that the classifier, without any additional retraining on exactly the same voxels that we had used previously, was able to discriminate addition versus subtraction. So in the same way that we could discriminate leftward versus rightward saccades, we could discriminate addition versus subtraction. And so this again tells us that those same brain systems that are involved in moving your eyes around in space, shifting your attention, are also involved when you're doing basic arithmetic. And so this suggests that there's a sort of integration of these numerical and spatial systems to support that mental number line, both when you're dealing with just individual magnitudes and when you're thinking about quantities. So if you're doing an addition, it's like moving your attention or your eyes to the right. If you're doing a subtraction, it's like moving your attention or your eyes to the left. And we see this in these fMRI studies, also in the ERP study I skipped, and it suggests that there's really this sort of spatial mapping when we're dealing with numbers. And so this then leads me to the last thing I want to talk about, which is children who struggle with math. We all have heard of dyslexia. There's a math version of this called dyscalculia, and it's about 10% of the population, so it's just as common as dyslexia. but almost nobody has heard of dyscalculia. Even educators, teachers out there in the schools haven't heard of dyscalculia. And scientific research is just now starting to catch up in exploring what's going on with math learning with dyscalculia. And so one idea is that if we go back to that foundation, that approximate number system, there are difficulties in that approximate number system. And that's supported by looking at performance on a simple task where children and adults are just asked to compare sets of dots. So if you need a small difference between the set of dots to compare, then this is a small number. So for example, for adults, when they're comparing 9 versus 10, 0.1 is the difference that they need. So basically 10%. On the other hand, if you need a large difference, then this is the large difference. So say, for example, 15 versus 10. What you can see here is that if we look at a group of 5-year-olds, this light gray traces their distribution. A group of 10-year-olds, this is their distribution. And so obviously 10-year-olds get better. Adults are even better than that. But if we look at 10-year-old children with dyscalculia, with math learning difficulties, they look just like the typically developing 5-year-olds. Those distributions are almost perfectly overlapping. So here are these children. Now maybe they were developing perfectly typically until they got to age 5, and then their brains didn't respond to those educational experiences in the typical way. Maybe they're on the same trajectory, but they're just delayed for the 10-year-old dyscalculic versus the typically developing. We don't know because this is just one data point. But then in a study that looked at comparing these arrays of dots, so non-symbolic quantities, they also found that people with dyscalculia recruited this intraparietal sulcus region less. So this suggests that there's a biological difference here. And we can even see that math learning difficulties are associated with, for example, low birth weight and fetal alcohol syndrome. Some evidence suggests also in Fragile X. So all of these different things that might hit parietal systems are also associated with math. These are people who don't have any of those sorts of things and just have a specific learning difficulty with math. So the suggestion is that as we start to better understand these brain systems for math, we start to understand the approximate number system and start to understand its links with counting, with symbols, and then also with space, that we might be able to not only identify, but even help to effectively remediate these math learning difficulties. And one attempt at this is an adaptive game that increases in difficulty. And it focuses on the same skills that I've been talking about today. So it looks at this approximate number system. So you just have to pick the side with more so that you get to move along a game board and then try and win the race. It starts to build links between quantities and symbols. And then it even has this spatially organized mental number line. You can see for higher levels, for example, it even starts to involve various different numeric operations. And this game, based on these sorts of principles, has been shown to be helpful for some of the children that are struggling with math learning difficulties. So to sort of wrap this up, you know, educational neuroscience is this emerging field that's bridging the social and the biological sciences. And I think that future progress in this field really will depend on bringing together educators, psychologists, and neuroscientists to find that common ground that we share when we're thinking about questions in education and neuroscience. And obviously, educational experiences are not the only one, but they are an important one that is building brains. And when we look at, for example, the brains of students here at UW-Madison, we're inherently selecting a very non-representative sample of brains. Right? So we do all these MRI studies on college undergraduates, but they get into an institution like this because they're not the average student in the state. In fact, you know, many of the students graduate high school and never go on to any university, much less a university like this. So we're always looking at these brains that have been built through educational experiences and are in some sense non-representative. We don't know how non-representative, but we know that they must in some sense be non-representative. And turning more specifically to the things that I'm looking at, we think about how language and education build these exact concepts of quantity. And then we link that to number symbols, space, eventually even onto higher order reasoning, which I haven't really had a chance to touch on. But then those same cognitive systems might be linked even in different ways to different brain systems depending on those experiences. And we can show how differences in brain structure and brain function relate to differences in math ability. And then the hope is that we can start to use these insights to explain math learning difficulties and even lead to targeted remediation to help out these children. So across the board, this type of field is leading to a number of different policy suggestions about the importance of math, about identifying math learning difficulties and then the things that we might do just in my lab, but then more broadly thinking about all of these as examples of this broader field. So I just want to say thank you, and thank you to all of my collaborators in Paris and at Vanderbilt. Thanks.